I had really chafed at a lot of the rules the entire time, but followed them just because I felt that I needed to be loyal to my parents, to the masters, and I believed at the time. So this statement about near beer from El Moria came out in a dictation. And that dictation was a shock to me. I hadn't been ready for it. I was sitting in the front row when it happened, and it shattered me because I thought to myself, well, if we're going to be that extreme where something that's not even actually alcohol is going to be banned because of a perception, and I didn't know this thing about the letter writing and what had gone on behind the scenes. I only found that out later from Aaron. It just struck me as being an extremist capitulation. I was furious. And after the dictation was over, I literally stormed out of the front row, went into the back of the sacristy where my mother had gone when she walked off the altar. And I got in her face. I mean, I really got in her face. And I said, how could you do that? You know this is important to me. You know that what this means and the symbolic nature of this. This means that we're extremists, we're fanatics. And she went, oh, Sean, I don't mind if you have some. And I was like, first of all, that's not the point. That's not the point. And second of all, you just admitted to me that you're a complete hypocrite about this.
Welcome to Blinded by the Light, a podcast where we explore the stories of trauma, PTSD, and healing from people who grew up in Church Universal and Triumphant and other unusual religions. I'm joined today by my co-host, Justice Bartlett.
I'm Justice of Illumination with Justice.com. My mission is to talk about the hard, the holy, and the human elements of our nature. And to that end, I write, offer private healing and hypnotherapy, and I'm based out of Bozeman, Montana, not too far from where we grew up, Baird.
Yeah, it's really not that far from where everything went down. We're going to talk today about the process of how members of cults and harmful religions actually make their exit and some of the tough things they have to go through to finally break free. We're going to take a couple of examples from a few fringe religions and then how each of us came to terms with the events and beliefs that helped us on our individual journeys out. Today, our guests are the hosts of the Radical Secular podcast, Sean Prophet, a former high-ranking member of Church Universal and Triumphant, and the son of Elizabeth Prophet, the now deceased leader of the Cut Church, and Christophe Difo, who also grew up in Cut and is now a labor and employment lawyer. Thanks for joining us today on this conversation, guys.
Yeah, we're so happy to be here. Thanks for having us on.
Absolutely. We are stoked, man. And it's just a great thing to be here, to hang out with you guys. And thanks for asking us.
Of course. Yeah. I love your podcast. I've listened to several episodes now, and a lot of inspiring things just to remember that separating religion from our public life is important. But there's a lot more to it than that. You guys cover a lot of great stuff.
We do. It gets deep.
Rational, impassioned conversations about these tough topics is important, especially right now.
Yeah, we're just coming off of the election. We recorded our first show a few weeks before, about 3 weeks before the election, but we published it 4 or 5 days before the election happened. And it was just kind of a mess of what's going to happen. And we're still dealing with the fallout from authoritarian rule and just people that don't want to let the reins go when they should be. So that kind of ties into a lot of what we're going to talk about today, because this era has shown us that a lot of people are prey to joining cults, and a cult doesn't have to be a religion. It can be an ideology. It can be a political faction. It can be a diet that you're into. It's not just religion or religious groups. And with that, we're just going to dive right into kind of one of the first steps that has to happen for people to leave. And that is recognition that you're actually in a cult. Kind of like the first step in AA, acknowledging that you have a problem. Houston, we have a problem. And the outside world can tell you that you're in a cult, but the member themselves often needs to have experiences with the outside world to recognize the abnormality of what's going on within the bubble or within that world. Can you guys talk a little bit about, your experiences with that?
Sure, I can start it. Do you want to go, Christophe?
No, Sean, go ahead, man. Do
Okay.
it.
All right. Well, it seems that the very things that you would need to have at your disposal to get out of a cult are the things that you deliberately put aside when you go into the cult. And there's a systematic process of sort of discounting and disqualifying information that comes from any other source, the exact information that you would need to, to figure out that you were in a cult.
Ain't that the truth?
Mm-hmm. And we obviously see how that played out in Cut, but I think since people are more familiar with what's going on with Republicans, we obviously know Fox News, right-wing talk radio, all of these other sources are feeding a constant rebuttal of any factual information. So every event that occurs is interpreted through a lens that distorts the event and causes people to turn more inward toward the cult as opposed to really being willing to look at disconfirming information.
Yeah. That's really interesting, Sean, because my experience with Cut was a little bit different. I think a bit different, frankly, than the three of you, only because my family was only involved in the Montana shelter cycle element of that for a pretty short amount of time, although those values and the ideas that were sort of Cut and cultish and all of that very much followed me back to New Jersey, which is where I grew up. And for me, it was, I joke around and I say that for me, it was all about mouthwash. That's how I got out of a cult. And let's just break that down for you. And that is, I had a serious drug problem all the way up as a young person, in my late teens and in through my early 20s. And, it was severe. I mean, like life, my life was in absolute shambles. I mean, I was close to death. It was stealing. It was lying. It was getting arrested. It was all the things that come along with like hardcore drug addiction. And, I eventually did end up getting clean and getting sober. And I was an Alcoholics Anonymous, actually. In Alcoholics Anonymous, you're taught that to drink is to die, right? It's just like there's this very rigid idea. And frankly, Alcoholics Anonymous is a really great fit for me because I grew up in this environment, this sort of cultish environment. And I'm not trying to call AA a cult directly, but it definitely has some of the elements, right? This sort of shame-based morality system, this idea that like once you leave, you are essentially a sinner. And look, they literally say Christian prayers in there. In any event, what I'm trying to get at is, getting involved in that environment was sort of like, it was a really interesting and useful transition for growing up in a very strict cult style household to finding like this surrogate family in Alcoholics Anonymous with this sort of like very strict, what we call the big book approach to sobriety. And it ended up being a really good fit for me. And that was problematic because it sort of compounded the issues that I was sort of wrestling with and trying to come to terms with. So I say mouthwash because one day I decided that I was going to use mouthwash with alcohol in it, and I had been told, and I believed, right, that for me to drink is to die. That means that I would drink and I would immediately spin out of control. And next thing you know, I'd be shooting heroin, right? Like that was what I thought would happen. And I did mouthwash and I was like, wait, that didn't happen. And that was like a little thread that sort of came out and was like, but if that's not true, right, then and then I started pulling, and it took years and years to pull that thread out. And I'll shut up after this because I know other people need to talk, but and I can come back to this, but it took me a long time to actually let that thread completely unravel and really start to get at the roots of it, right? Because I credited alcoholics, I credited my dad was really instrumental in my recovery, and he was really into cut, right? And so I credit a lot of cut and that theology to my recovery, right? And so those things ended up becoming very fused for me. And so as I started to sort of question the ideas of sobriety and the ideas of Alcoholics Anonymous, which I could talk about at length, but I won't right now. I simultaneously, therefore, it began to unravel my cult theology mindset in which I had lived and had been indoctrinated. So it was more of a process, but definitely it started with mouthwash, man. And that's where it fucking started, was with mouthwash.
That's interesting. I could add to that a little bit if you'd like, unless you have another question.
Yeah. Go ahead, Sean.
Okay. Well, there was a story that involved near beer that was a big disconfirming event for me in terms of the church, because as you know, the church has a huge prohibition on alcohol. You can't drink at all. It's not like people can drink a little bit, although I think some people in the church did, but it was considered to be an excommunicable offense. However, at a certain point after the shelter cycle, things started to loosen up a little bit, and we actually started stocking near beer at the general store at the ranch. Nobody thought it was a big deal. It has less than 0.5% of alcohol, which is something along the lines of orange juice or apple juice or any other fruit juice that has natural fermentation, right? And so nobody really thought that this was going to become an issue alcohol-wise. But apparently, some of the people who were in the community who were into being there and living kind of a strict monastic existence started getting irritated that there were other people in the community who were having beers, or what appeared to be having beers. And that there were lots of, there were 6-packs and there were empties in the trash cans. And, this was really flipping people's lids at the ranch.
Sorry, I'm sorry to laugh. It's just
it's funny.
But it's fucking funny.
It's funny.
Sorry, go ahead, Sean.
So some of those people wrote letters, and as this was talked about in the Prophet's Daughter book, it was described that my sister Erin and my mother used to do a lot of what they called altar work, where they would go take these letters and questions and things having to do with the management of the community to El Moria and get answers. And it was Erin who was giving the answers. And as we found out reading Prophet's Daughter, it was her setting a lot of the timelines and things for the shelters as well. But as far as the near beer was concerned, the answer came back from El Moria that near beer was a no-go, that was not something that anyone in the community should be doing. And of course, I was a minister at the time, and after I hadn't gotten out yet, and after the shelter cycle, I was kind of trying to see my way clear to a time where the community could be a bit more relaxed, where maybe we would, start to become a center of art and culture. We'd build our headquarters. We'd have a school. We would have a television show that would broadcast internationally. All the ambitions that the church had. We had a big studio complex sort of design that was going to be part education, part media production, part publishing. So anyway, I was still at that time thinking that I would be staying in the church. I had really chafed at a lot of the rules the entire time, but followed them just because I felt that I needed to be loyal to my parents, to the masters, and I believed at the time. So this statement about near beer from El Moria came out in a dictation. And that dictation was a shock to me. I hadn't been ready for it. I was sitting in the front row when it happened, and it shattered me because I thought to myself, well, if we're going to be that extreme where something that's not even actually alcohol is going to be banned because of a perception. And I didn't know this thing about the letter writing and what had gone on behind the scenes. I only found that out later from Aaron. But it just struck me as being an extremist capitulation. And I was furious. And after the dictation was over, I literally stormed out of the front row, went into the back of the sacristy where my mother had gone when she walked off the altar. And I got in her face. I mean, I really got in her face. And I said, how could you do that? You know, this is important to me. You know that what this means and the symbolic nature of this. This means that we're extremists, we're fanatics. And she went, oh, Sean, I don't mind if you have some. And I was like, first of all, that's not the point. That's not the point. And second of all, you just admitted to me that you're a complete hypocrite about this. You're going to make an exception for me because you know it's important to me. But what about the rest of the community? That means I can't have near beers with anyone in the community. I have to hide it. I'm doing this wrong thing, that I have to hide. So that was really a turning point for me. Actually, it was probably about a year and a half before I left. But it really, and then I found out, because she further explained to me about the empties and the trash cans and how it was upsetting people and that they wanted to be in a spiritual community. And I got the rationale behind it. But what it solidified to me was this had been a political decision. And yet it came through her in her role as a messenger. So what it meant to me is that the messengership itself was corrupted.
Yeah, I'm just going to tie into that real quick. When my dad first claimed that he was the successor to Elizabeth Prophet, like being the next messenger in that succession, there was some messages that he got about like my mom's parents and just weird things that didn't make sense, like coming from heaven or coming from some ether, some spiritual ether, because they were so driven by his personal issues. So I just wanted to throw that out there because it sounds like it's pretty easy for that kind of stuff to get corrupted. So it makes it hard for me to take it seriously now.
Well, we talk about this all the time on the show in the sense that this is the primary, other than money or sex, God is the primary corrupting influence because people attempt to speak for God. And there's just no way you can separate out. If you think that you're in communication with something spiritual, you can't separate that out from your own mind.
Right.
Yeah. And it kind of becomes a rabbit hole too, because I realized several years ago that if you make the leap from believing that one person can communicate with dozens, or I don't know how many ascended masters there were, now that were created, but if you believe that, okay, well, that person can communicate with 3, well, then it's 5, and then it's 20, and then it's almost an unlimited number. Where does it end? And I think it kind of opens a rabbit hole of a lot of different beliefs, and some of the more crazy ones that are like alternate versions of history or pseudoscience, all kinds of nutty things.
Yeah.
Well, you've got like all of these different kind of internal personalities within any individual as well. And it's just an opportunity for your subconscious to go wild. It's like, I'm going to take this bias that I'm aware of, and then this other bias that I'm not even completely aware of is going to move to the foreground and create this story or this narrative or possibly this rule set around this thing. And then people are going to take that to be, God's truth. They're going to take that to be the spoken word, to use the term that was used in Church Universal and Triumphant, right? And you don't have the people on the ground even using the same discernment. It's like being with the Pope. Like it becomes infallible.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that once the words are spoken from the altar, they can't be taken back.
Right.
And And I knew that at the time when that dictation, because it came from the altar. It would have been one thing if she'd had a staff meeting or whatever, then maybe the rules could have changed a year later. But once it comes from the altar, there's a transcript. It gets turned into a pearl of wisdom. It gets sent out to the world. This is now church doctrine. There's no walking it back.
For me, my big disillusionment moment was actually with what I perceived to be a lack of humanity with Elizabeth Clare Prophet. One of the community members had died suddenly of a heart attack. He was a gentleman I had known my entire life. My father was the last person to see him. My dad was a chiropractor, not a medical doctor. And he disappeared afterwards. My dad was sensitive and I was extremely sensitive. And like all of a sudden there's all this hearsay and this gossip going around. And it comes down through the chain of gossip that Elizabeth had blamed my dad for his death because he was the last person who had seen him.
Wow.
And that he should have known better. He should have done something. He should have recognized these unrecognizable symptoms, right? And then my dad disappeared. And so I heard that. And I think I was 13 or 14 when that happened. And I don't remember there being a lot of discussion in the church about compassion. And I don't ever remember hearing the word empathy until I was much later in my life, right? It was not part of our colloquial discussion, but I knew what it was. And I knew that that statement and that those actions coming down from the head of this church were completely devoid of something human. And I was disgusted from that moment forward.
When was that, Justice?
I want to say 93 or 94, probably. It was a good couple of years before we left, because then I sank into a pretty good rebellious phase. That was around the time I started smoking. That was around the time I just stopped listening to anyone about anything at all. I mean, I kind of already didn't. My first disillusion moment was when I was 9, coming out of the shelters after we had allegedly decreed away the end of the world, right? And I'm 9 and I'm standing around that awful old-fashioned toaster in the cafeteria, just waiting for my toast to come out.
The toaster, the fucking toaster. I forgot about the toaster.
And the giant piles of butter and just like that warm, comforting bread. Like, God help me. Like, what did I just go through? And like, I know I was in shock now, looking back. And I'm like looking around at these adults and they're all congratulating themselves on stopping the end of the world. And it's like, well, why aren't we all dead? Our decrees averted Armageddon. And I remember grabbing my toast and being like, what a crock of shit. You guys are fucking retarded. Like at 9 years old, like, I don't know that was the language that went around that like concept. It might have been. But that was the feeling. I was like, oh my God, I'm surrounded by idiots. I'm never going to survive. Like, how am I going to make it through this?
I mean, it was such a self-serving narrative as these, whenever there's even a book, I think, called When Prophecy Fails. And it just talks about how apocalyptic movements survive the disillusionment and the breakdown. And a lot of times some people leave, but other people become more dedicated. They double down. And I think that's what we're seeing. We saw that in Cut. We saw that, and we're definitely seeing that with the whole Trump cult.
Yeah, that was the next thing I was going to say is like, though, that mentality we talked about earlier, that, none of this is relegated to religion or anything, right? Like that cult mentality can be branded in various different ways, and Trumpism and political affiliation, social affiliation can absolutely do that, and we're seeing that, right? I had a conversation with somebody. Conversation is a really generous way to put it. It was a Instagram back and forth, I guess. And as I'm fond of saying, Instagram is sort of just a hotbed of terrible ideas. And, this is a guy who was telling me, I posted something. Oh, you know what? It was like just number up, just number 306. Someone had tweeted that because that's the number of electoral votes that Biden won. And this guy was like, oh, it's not over yet. And then he went on to say a bunch of different things. But again, like at this point, that kind of person who is still defending this, whatever the cult is. It reminds me of like my parents, frankly, like, right. My dad on the other side of this, still to this day, defending that. Right. And it's just like, wow. It's just remarkable to see. It's remarkable to see. And it's so uniform, right? We see this. I mean, we see this in in post cult people all the time. It's terrible.
And I wanted to sort of bring that back to my original story about the near beer, which is obviously kind of a small thing. But what you have to realize is that we'd already rationalized all these big things. Rationalized the failure of the prophecy. We'd rationalized spending tens of millions of dollars, of mortgaging everything, of selling everything. I mean, the church sold off its centers in Colorado Springs, Minneapolis, Chicago, all over the world. It sold off all of its centers. It had everybody come to the ranch. It borrowed money. It mortgaged property. I mean, so much went into this massive underground construction. And then we hadn't needed it. And at the time when this dictation occurred, we were already a year or two removed from all of those giant kind of pieces of cognitive dissonance that we'd all had to swallow. And now, I don't know why this near beer thing was the last straw, but it really was, because I guess I'd held hope that we could kind of come out of that, learn from our mistakes, move forward, and build something. I still really wanted to build something because we had just finished building this giant construction project that was underground and now useless. I wanted to do it right. I wanted to build the community that we had gone up there to build in the first place. And so when it became clear that our divine guidance was not divine, it just kind of maybe it really just crystallized all of the falsehoods that had come up. And at that time, I wasn't aware to the extent that Aaron had been involved in setting the timelines and things. I knew some things, but I was out of the loop. There was a special loop between my mother and my sister that I was not a part of.
For some people, it's a series of events. Like, it sounds like pretty much for all of you guys, it was a series of events that led to you saying, something's wrong here. I need to figure this out. And I was around it daily until I went to college. And it wasn't until, like, things felt wrong in college. Like, I felt like I was pushing against the world. Like, I felt like I was pushing against an alternate narrative. I knew the truth. I knew what was right. And so people would challenge me, but it wasn't until I was about 23, a few years after college, and one of my roommates, who was pretty progressive, and he was willing to talk with me, and he was an atheist, which was actually really helpful because he didn't have a bias against the church in terms of like, oh, you're worshiping Satan, or you're, any number of narratives that people in the community of Livingston would have said about cut kids, that their parents were like doing evil rituals, or, he didn't have any of that preconceived notion of it. So we would just sit down and we would talk, and we would talk about political issues. And something that really bothered me when we first started talking was I couldn't really explain why I held the viewpoints I did about being conservative on gay marriage, being conservative on marijuana, being conservative on the death penalty. Like, I could only explain it in the framework of the church. And when he challenged me on those issues, I really started to dig deeper and be like, well, why do I actually believe these things? And I realized that I only believed them because it was the worldview I was told, and it was the things I had been indoctrinated with for 18 plus years. And so we talked about these issues more and more, especially gay marriage. Like, that was the one that really was a capstone for me. And I believe in equality. Like, I believed in equality all my life, even though there were some things that my parents told me as a kid that told me that they didn't 100% believe in equality. And I don't remember which parent it was, so I'm not going to call out one parent saying this, but I specifically remember a parent saying, we're not equal because of our karma. And I was like, whoa, that's really weird. Like, to say that because of things that happened hundreds or thousands of years ago, that I'm not equal to you, Sean, or I'm not equal to you, Justice, when I'm born, that we are born unequal to one another. That really felt wrong to me, and weird that gay people or transgender people or people who use drugs would somehow be lesser people. And I was told that narrative my whole life, that if you do any number of things, if you drink alcohol, if you smoke, if you're gay, if you have certain types of sex, that you are basically like a lower evolution, or your soul is not evolved as much. So it was really the equality piece that started to unravel it for me. And also this idea that basically my whole worldview that was given to me through my parents was dictated by a couple of people standing with authority, and that everything I'd been told about the way to see the world and the way to see myself basically was coming from one source. And it wasn't even really coming from their life experiences. So then I started kind of figuring out, well, who am I and what do I believe? And then that kind of unraveled it. My dad being a messenger, claiming to be an ascended master messenger, and having a lot of homophobia. Like even when I was a kid, him throwing out the word fag, like just when we'd be watching TV, and I'm like, a person that considers themselves to be holy and on this path and like degrading other people, like that really felt wrong to me. Even from a young age, I knew it was wrong. And then when he continued to do that and continued to express homophobia in kind of weird ways, I started to realize that the whole belief system carried a lot of these fear-driven things that were very unhealthy. And so it took years, like it really took years to have a lot of these epiphanies. And it wasn't really one event. It was more just the behavior of people and continuously running into people that seemed to have a lot of cognitive dissonance. Once I was in college and then didn't live at home anymore, like that was a big thing, was being physically away from my parents really helped me to develop my own identity and to develop just my own beliefs about the world that weren't shaped by the church.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, there's so much to unpack there. Who wants to go?
Wow, yeah, that was like really. I mean, one thing that just jumped. Like, I'll just make this quick, but you talked about, your dad and expressing homophobia, and that interestingly for me now, all these years later, was the breaking point for me with my father. And I don't have a relationship with him in any meaningful way right now. We don't really talk at all. And that wasn't always the case. And again, because my dad was, because of sort of this sort of mission of mercy type vibe that you get from like hyper religious types. And I'm grateful for this, frankly. He was a person who was willing to give me a chance when I was at the end of my rope, and he was supportive. But just like a Christian missionary or a Christian missionary, rehab or whatever, it came with a big dose of cut, right? Mm-hmm. And even that would be okay. But now I look at it, and it got to the point about a couple of years ago where I was just with my father, like, look, I can't deal with the homophobia. Like, right. Mm-hmm. I can't turn a blind eye to that. Like it is something that in the past I was able to turn a blind eye to, but as these issues have become more salient and I have been able to fully understand these, issues of gender identity and just replace that with race. Mm-hmm. How can I with a straight face call myself a progressive, and serious about justice, while meanwhile I am just turning a blind eye to outright homophobia? And I just that inner conflict became, that dissonance became way too loud for me. And I was like, look, dude, I can't do this with you anymore. Goodbye. And so when you mentioned about that, it was interesting that you were talking about homophobia as a breaking point for you in the past, but that for me recently in the last several years has been a breaking point for me with my father. So I just wanted to, I could talk a lot, but I won't, because other people have things to say, because you had a really great stuff to say there, Baird. So thank you for that also.
Yeah, thank you. I have a lot to say about it. I think that there is a reason. I mean, you can get into oversimplifications, but sometimes I think it really is simple. And I think there's a reason why a lot of religions are against homosexuality, because they are at their core fertility cults. You go back to some of the things that we've been talking about on our show about evolutionary psychology and the use of religion to unite a culture, right? The idea is not just to bind, it binds people together, gives them cohesion, but also gives them encouragement to reproduce, to be fruitful, multiply, and to overwhelm the other tribe. And so in a tribal sense, if your group is competing against other cultures, you need soldiers, you need workers, you need all of this. And so the big families, the no contraception, the no abortion, it all falls into place when you look at religion at its core as a human fertility guarantor, that your tribe will flourish. And so it's an evolutionary thing, I think.
That's really curious. That was something that Annie Newhouse brought up on one of our recent podcasts, was that she noticed that there was a lot of really large families in the church, and as well as the Catholic Church as well.
Yep.
For me, I feel like I just keep coming back to the dehumanization of people, no matter whether it's dressed up as homophobia, whether it's dressed up as a spiritual sort of hierarchy mindset, like I've balanced more karma than you, so therefore I'm better, like whatever it is. I remember one of my cracking moments was when it was an ethics course being taught by the principal of the school. And there was this habitual, repetitive indoctrination that we were so special because we were light bearers, right? And part of that narrative was how when we were going to go out into the world, people would recognize our light, and because they didn't have any of their own, they would want to steal it. And
oh yes,
you remember
Stealing
that
light.
one?
Oh, I remember the stealing the light. Forgot about that. Yes, I remember that though.
Stealing the light. So in that moment, like I felt like I call her my little inner angry goddess, because she's like a little pop-up like flaming head in my like inner psyche that's like, that's not right, like that sounds ridiculous. And like to prove it, like I went out when I left the church and I wound up interacting with drug addicts and all kinds of degenerates, and like I found the humanity in everybody I've ever interacted with, always. Just humans who are hurting, who are doing the best that they can. That's what we all boil down to, right? But what I see when I look back is this sort of unintentional sort of victimization of us. They're painting us as victims. It's like they're painting us as like the savior and the victim in the same broad stroke. It's like you're so special that they're going to victimize you. Like you're going to get martyred because they want what you have. And at the same time, like it's a spiritual organization, it's also creating this fragility around having a spiritual identity. Like your identity as a spiritual being is so fragile. It's so special, but it also, it makes you susceptible to these vampires and towards being taken advantage of.
Well, there's so much that plays into this. There's something that Christophe and I talk about a lot, and that is the just world fallacy. Okay. And that plays into karma, because this allows you to excuse poverty, sickness, misfortune of any kind, and blame the victim that this was their karma. And then there's another aspect to it, which is you bring in demons and discarnate entities into the whole thing. So it's not just that you're going out there and that there's something wrong with you having sex. Basically, it's this battle where this person's entities are going to steal your light, and you're going to get the entities in your aura, and pretty soon You're not going to have enough light to make your ascension. And there's all of these just ongoing narratives that seek to not just dehumanize, but also to control behavior.
Yes.
Because if you fear being possessed by demons, if you fear your karma, if you fear your loss of your ascension, that's something that, I mean, 10,000 years of outer darkness, 50,000, a million. I mean, how long could it be? In Scientology, I think that it's a billion or something. Like all of these organizations have these ridiculously long periods of time that if you don't, it's all come down to this life and this decision and this messenger. And if you don't follow this messenger, you fail your ultimate test for 10,000 years or 50,000 years and hundreds of embodiments. And you might go to the second death, and they threaten you with even that. So I don't know how anybody gets their head out of all of that at the same time. It's just a long process.
We've talked about it, and Christophe, you mentioned it already as well, that there's such a strong correlation to the addiction mentality, as well as extracting yourself from an addiction, as well as extracting yourself from a cult or from a fundamental religion, because it so infiltrates the way that you think about, the way that you see, the way that you feel. And I would say even at like a biochemical level, because you start creating a different kind of neurochemistry when you're in this kind of group mindset. And I mean, I had this thought recently on one of our podcasts about like the dictations and like the decreeing that would go on to prepare for the channeling. Then it's like, okay, you're creating this massive sort of group trance where you're literally preparing everyone's mind to be at its most susceptible point to take in whatever information is being delivered from that stage. And like, if that doesn't sort of like, I mean, that defines what an altered state is. And I would say that you could probably test people's brainwaves and they would be in altered different states of brainwaves from their normal waking brainwave states, right? That's no different than what a drug does to your system.
Mm-hmm.
Only you don't have the drug to say, this is what's doing this to me. You have to look like intricately at all of your choices, all of your beliefs, all of your behaviors, everything that you've wrapped around that narrative, who you believe yourself to be in that system, and dismantle that.
Yeah. And at the end of the day, you don't even get to be fucking high at the end. I mean, come on. I mean, look, right? I mean, come on, right? I mean, there's a lot of collateral damage here, but at least you get high.
You don't even get near beer, apparently.
You don't even get near beer high. You don't even get near beer high. No, but Justice, I think you're right on point with that. I really, really do. And I know that we share experience in that world and know what that's like. And I wonder how you all, I know for me that, it was one of the challenges that I've had as an adult and as a post, cut cult, whatever person, is taming that voice of shame that sort of follows me around. Right. And Catholics talk about that shame. Jewish folks also, especially on the East Coast, like Northeast Jewish culture is a very specific thing, and there's a lot of that sort of shame-based sort of structure there. I just know for me that even now, I'm 39, going to be 40 this year, and I think of myself as liberated from the cult mentality for quite some time now, over a decade, certainly. And still though, one of the challenges that I face is, and less so than ever before, but still one of those recurring challenges that I face is being able to exist and just be okay being Christophe Difo and not feeling like I need to do X, or I should be doing Y, or and here's a big one: if only I had done A, then B wouldn't have happened, right? And that is shit is like fuck. It just like drilled into your mind in that kind of culture, and like ridding myself of that after years of explicit work, not like casual work, explicit work, right? Years of therapy, like X, Y, and Z. Still, it lives there.
Well, and I think all of us, I guess, Justice, you're a therapist, right?
Yeah.
And the other three of us are in therapy, I think, right?
I've been in lots of therapy too.
I sure as hell am.
So
Gosh, I wish I'd started like at 18, but I didn't start until a few months ago, actually.
Yeah.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Good for you.
Yeah,
Man.
so-
Good for you. It's amazing.
Yeah, very good. It's necessary. You can't get
Necessary.
you cannot process this experience without therapy and years of it. I'm sorry to say.
Yeah, that's accurate.
And I wanted to bring up something going back to what you said, because I think there's more to be covered in terms of homosexuality and all of the shame about being gay and leaving the church. And I have to say that was one of the last things to go for me. And it took years. And it took probably, I think I got over criticizing people for being gay right around the same time that I decided that the masters weren't real. And that was probably about 4 to 5 years after I actually left. And it took a long time.
Yeah.
Because when I had first left, it was more like I don't buy this messengership. I don't buy that this channel is accurate, because I'd seen all the things, and there were disagreements also between, big management disagreements in the organization that I had with the other directors and my mother. And so there were those things, but somehow I didn't come to question the existence of God, the existence of El Moria, Saint Germain, Jesus, and all of the other 200 or whatever masters that there are.
But don't forget Afra, the token.
Afra.
Don't forget the token black, the token black master, right?
It's like the Mormon Church. Afra didn't exist until the 70s.
Yeah, exactly. For some reason, yeah. And then all of a sudden, when it became important to like bring Africa into the group and into the fold, Afra's here. Anyway.
Well, you're certainly not going to find Afra, I don't think, in the IM teachings. So if that tells you anything at all.
Yeah, right.
And we talked a little bit with Joe Zimhart about some of this.
Yeah.
And that was another good episode that I think your listeners on Blinded by the Light would probably enjoy, because it goes into tracing some of that history and some of the racism and fascism, really, frankly, that permeated the predecessor organizations.
And some of it goes back to Madame Blavatsky and Nazi Germany, doesn't it?
No question.
Yeah, we mentioned that on previous podcasts as well.
No question about it. And so, but I wanted to talk about me getting rid of the homophobia. And it really came down to, I was working with some guys who were gay, and because it was LA, 90s, and were gay guys around, and I got to know them very well, which I hadn't really been exposed to anyone. I mean, I was over 30, and I had not yet really been exposed to gay people other than, doing some horrible things. Like, we used to go, it was in LA, it was right around the time when the AIDS crisis first hit, and they would have these marches, and some of us from the church would go and make fun of the people who were marching. Because that's how deep the homophobia was in the organization. And I remember somebody saying something to me about, this could be your family. This could be your brother or father, dying of HIV. And at the time, of course, the Reagan administration treated HIV just like Trump is treating COVID. Just exactly. They make jokes about it. They made gay jokes in the press room of the White House. You can go back and watch these videos.
Yep.
And so it was a disgraceful thing. And I'm ashamed of the fact that, we were in LA. Here we were, and we're supposedly this this enlightened organization serving the Great White Brotherhood, serving the Ascended Masters, and we are making fun of a deadly disease that's killing our fellow citizens. And
Yeah.
so I had a lot of guilt about that because, and when you've done those things, and then you have to kind of come to terms with the fact that there is nothing wrong with being gay. And these are real people who I met and worked with. And one guy who was a friend of mine, he was basically married before it was really legal to be married, but he had, his boyfriend was like his husband. And I'd gone to their parties. I'd hung out with them, and they were really cool people. And I remember having some kind of deep conversations with this guy in the tape room at the video company I was working at. And I would say things to him like, did you fail with women? Is that why you're gay? I was just horrible, cringeworthy shit, okay, that I was saying to this guy. But he, I'm sure being used to it, he's like, no, he's like, I got married. I was miserable. I wanted to kill myself. I couldn't do it. And so it really made me think. And then I was also going through a divorce, and I was experiencing the pain of that. And then I suddenly started to flip over and realize, wait a minute, this is how gay people feel too when they lose someone they love. And that sense of empathy is what really pulled me out finally of the whole homophobia thing. Because it was like, okay, first of all, I can't deny this person and who he is. And he was a fine person, like good worker, honest, intelligent, all of those things. And so what, God was going to send him to the second death because he was gay. I mean, it just made no sense. So that was a big turning point for me. And I think that's a turning point for a lot of people, because you've had at least one person on your show who is gay or bi. And, and we see this coming up over and over again, that the people who had the hardest time in cut were people who were gay and repressing it and not coming out and all of those things. And so I don't know. It's just like there's a lot there that needs to be explored, I think, because for people who are still in the organization, I think that's like the third rail. If you're gay, you're going to hell. I mean, there's no question. You can't make your ascension. You're done.
I'm Sean, thanks so much for sharing that, man, and talking about that, because first of all, I should say that as a young man growing up in a very conservative county in New Jersey, and trying, and also the only Black person in my class, and also coming from being homeschooled and being in a cult, everything, I just wanted to fit in, and fine, understandable. But I look back at that and I say to myself, man, though, it was the 90s, and throwing around the F word, right? Come on. That was just like saying you were lame, that was equivalent of saying, oh, you're a dork, right? Or a geek, or whatever, and I feel awful about that. And I wonder, another point I wanted to bring up relatedly, as you were talking, it made me think, is just is how, as I've gotten older and frankly been detoxed from that world, and I really think of it as detox as a person who spent more than enough time in detoxes, and the idea of really of sitting there and quivering as toxic ideas in this case are extracted from my mind, and being able to look at those for the first time in a clear way. I look back and I think about what for me was sexuality growing up, right? We in the church, we all know that was suppressed, right? The idea of sexuality, but even set aside for the moment complex ideas of sexuality, right? That we all have, or most of us have, if we're serious about looking at them. But even the most basic ideas about sexuality, i.e., people have sex, was something that was a topic that was beyond beyond something that I could have. And certainly as I became an adolescent and became a sexual being, these were things that I absolutely could not talk about with my father or certainly not my mom. My mom's idea was just basically to yell at me for watching porn, right? But ultimately, to her credit, she was really she was good about it, right? She really was. My dad, though, perhaps the person that I should have been having conversations about sexuality and what it means to be an adult male, and what it means to be responsible, and what a condom is, and these sort of things, right? These are conversations that we couldn't have because my dad literally, and I believe this, could not have those conversations. It's not that he made a choice not to. This was outside of the realm of, based on his belief system, the cut belief system, connected to his sort of conservative upbringing, from a conservative African family. These are conversations we couldn't have. And so what I'm getting at here, and I'll close in this issue with this, is just that, I wonder how you all think about how your exploration of your sexuality was stunted, and how has that changed? I know for me, it has changed, right? And I think about my sexuality, I think, in a much more dynamic way than I ever did before. Not just like a wham bam, thank you, ma'am, or the boys, blah, 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 sort of way. And also just as thinking of sexuality as, frankly, on a spectrum, right? As opposed to some sort of binary or even trinary way of thinking about it. Anyway, that's my piece. And I'm interested to hear what you all have to say about that.
That was one of the big confusing points for me, because there was it was so verboten, right? To go into those lower chakras and to have those discussions and to even acknowledge or explore those feelings. And that was another one of my kind of cognitive dissonance moments with the red leather suit, right? With Guru Ma in the red leather suit. What is she doing in that damn suit? We are not allowed to wear red. What is going on?
Mind blown.
Right? Is she doing a Michael Jackson? What is going on here? And I remember it was explained away as she was representing the ruby ray. I was like, what the fuck does that mean?
Yeah, it's not red, it's pink.
It was so confusing. And then when we started fooling around in junior high into high school, and just making out, it was one of my closest friends was told that what she was doing was completely unnatural, that she was only interested in boys because she had no relationship with her father. It's no, it's because we're 14 and our hormones are raging. Come on, don't psychologize this. This is just normal human exploration. I've always been pushy. I've always been edgy. I've always been okay, if this is so bad, let's get it out of the way. Let's see what it's really about. So I went out and had sex when I was 15, and I came back to the ranch, and I was convinced that they were going to be able to read my aura, and I was going to kick the fuck out. And that I was going to be excommunicated for having sex. And I was terrified. I was utterly terrified. It gave me a neuroses,
In our day, I'm talking about in the 70s, there was a girl who just got caught kissing a guy in a broom closet or something in our school. And, there were people everywhere, so there was nowhere to go for these kids. They lived on campus. There was nowhere to go.
Right.
So they were making out in a broom closet, and they literally both got kicked out of school. That was it for them. They got sent home.
Jeez.
Wow.
Yeah. It was hardcore. And very. So I can't imagine.
Was that Pasadena, or was
that was Pasadena?
Okay.
Yeah. Pasadena was a small campus. It was actually our best campus because there's housing for everybody. You didn't have to ride the bus to some crazy location somewhere. There was enough housing for everybody to live right there. So I'm surprised more shit didn't happen in Pasadena. Probably did, and we just never found out about it.
Oh my gosh.
Probably did.
I was like the goody two shoes kid growing up, but just because of the idea that like your behavior needs to be perfect, otherwise you're making karma and all that. But it did tie into the sexuality because I felt so guilty about like even looking at pictures of naked women, you know. And then I didn't kiss a girl until like a kiss of my own volition, not like somebody saying, oh, go in the closet and, you know, whatever seconds in heaven. I can't remember the name of the game. You know, beyond something like that, I didn't actually kiss a woman until I was like 21 or 22. And I didn't have sex until I was like maybe 26. I was either 25 or 26.
Shit.
Wow.
And so it was like really delayed exploration of that part of myself, and just unpacking like what is healthy versus not healthy, and just trying to push away all the narratives that I was told as a kid. And that's a pretty difficult thing to do when there's that voice in your head, kind of what you were talking about, Christophe, that guilt voice, and a narrative of like, should I be doing this or should I not be doing this? And I think it can really tie into sexuality, just because if you have what might be totally normal desires, you can think that they're unnatural, you know, especially if it's a consenting relationship, B, you're not going to injure somebody. And yeah. And if it's, you know, done in a healthy way. And yeah, the one that really, I brought it up, I think, on our first podcast, but the one that really stuck out to me was oral sex, because like you forfeit your ascension if you have oral sex. And
I didn't even know if that was true. Like, Jesus Christ. I mean,
yeah.
Come on, man.
It's actually a thing. And there were tapes about this that were played to everybody who came onto permanent staff. Any of the married couples had to listen to these tapes. And of course, I was ordained a minister when I was like 23. And so I was also involved in counseling couples and performing marriage ceremonies. And a lot of times I was performing ceremonies for people who were a lot older than me and probably a lot more experienced. And, you know, I'm this 23-year-old kid, and I'm having to tell these couples, now, you know, you can't have oral sex. And these are people who are getting married. They're getting married. I mean, first of all, they probably already have. And second of all, you know, it's just like, it was so embarrassing. I had to give them this speech, and it was just like, it was mortifying. God, you know, like, what are we doing?
It's awful.
There are actual tapes.
There's tapes. Yeah.
Wow.
I remember because I used to go into the, this was back in the Santa Barbara days when it was a lot smaller, but there was a room where they kept all the archives. And then there was a special cabinet in there, and it had all the like confidential tapes. And one of them was called Oral Sex and Clearance. And I finally, one day I got the tape out and played it. And it was someone kind of confessing that, you know, that they had this, like what they considered to be an addiction to oral sex, and they couldn't get rid of it. And so my mom was doing her, you know, bolts and blaze and, you know, all the stuff that she used to do to try to exorcise those entities from that person. And then she proceeded to give, and this was all in front of like the whole staff. And
oh God,
she proceeded to give about 30 or 45 minutes worth of teaching as to how bad oral sex was. It was, you know, you're misaligning the chakras, you're taking this energy, you're not going to have enough energy to make your ascension. And by the way, the same thing was true for masturbation. And there was a horrible story about masturbation. There was someone who was a woman who was very much loved in the community as a leader. And this person had written a confession letter that she had been masturbating. And this was aired at the time in front of probably 75 or 100 staff members. And she was singled out and called up and in front of and then after that, there was another, this was two separate incidents, but it led to a whole crackdown on masturbation where at Camelot, there was a dictation that was given, and it was basically said, you are not, if you masturbate, you're not allowed in the chapel for 6 months. And the next Sunday, the place was like half empty.
I love that people just like cop to it, right? They're just like, yeah.
Half of them cop to it. The rest were liars, you know?
Yeah, of course, exactly. 50% of the people were like, yeah, you know what? I jerked off yesterday. Yeah, like, definitely did. I was diddling yesterday. It happened. And that's all right, though. Like, I'm not going to show up. It's worth it.
But it's just terrifying that you've got all these young people who are supposed to be celibate, and now you're cracking down on their last sort of outlet, right? And not only that, the violation of the priest penitent, where this is someone who has confessed.
Yes.
And the rationale on this, by the way, was that this person was on permanent staff, and so when you're on permanent staff, you give up any of those rights to sort of not be like, you could be made an example of at any time on permanent staff. That was one of the sort of rules.
So I have a question for you, Sean, that you might know that other people wouldn't. Was there ever any reports of sexual abuse in the community?
I am aware of at least 2 or 3 incidents where a father had sexually assaulted their own child.
Wow.
And those people were dealt with harshly. They were kicked out, but I do not believe that any authorities were informed or any prosecutions happened.
Right. It was handled within the community.
It was handled within the community. They were kicked out, but they didn't suffer, from what I know, from what I understand and what I remember, they weren't prosecuted. And I believe in at least one case, this went on for years. It was going on for years. And it was someone I knew. It was someone who had been in the school.
Oh, wow.
A girl who I'd gone to school with. Just came out that her father had been molesting her for, who knows, 5 years, Jesus. Who knows? God. So I have not heard about any of those things that happened in Montana. This was all stuff that happened Pasadena, Camelot years.
I've always wondered, because it seems almost impossible that you create such stringent rules around sexuality in particular, where it doesn't breed neuroses, and then combined with the isolation, and it's like it's just a festering ground for something nasty to happen.
$100 that there were all kinds of sexual abuse that we don't know about in the community.
Right. Yeah. And look, I mean, it's hard it's hard in 2020 to really understand the extent of sexual assault and rape. And these things are like just disgustingly, but also understandably underreported, right? It's really hard, I think, for to come forward. It's hard in an environment where there's a really great chance that you won't be taken seriously, right? And that you will end up being on trial, right? You're like, your sexual history, your sexual past will end up being on trial. So this is in 2020. I can only imagine in 1979 through 1994 or whatever, like what that must have looked like. And especially in the power structure that existed, the explicit power structure, right? That existed in that environment.
Yeah, and when I said I bet $100, it's literally statistics. Okay, you can't have a community with hundreds of staff members and thousands of members and only have had 3 incidents that I know about that are of child sexual abuse. You look at that statistics with Catholic Church, with Boy Scouts, with even like the wrestling scandals that have happened, and they're
the numbers I was reading on the Catholic Church most recently was that they had, like in the movie Spotlight, they talked about there was 6% of the community. Well, there's another report. It's the John something report that you can find it on the internet. His statistics are now saying that it's more likely going to wind up being closer to 10% of the priesthood. There are over 400,000 ordained priests in circulation right now.
Right.
So you're looking at a numbers of like 40,000 people.
Right. Yeah, and so I don't know exactly. It's hard to imagine because like most of the ministers in the church were like you'd never suspect.
Right.
So like in cut, I don't know if you guys had anybody you think was weird, but I can't. I wouldn't accuse anyone in our church of being in that category. So I don't know.
Yeah, I can't think of anybody off the bat that gave me that signal. I had people that I would go toe to toe with, but not under those grounds, but just knowing statistically and just knowing like particularly with the forced celibacy rules and how aside from being given these conditions where like you're not going to go to heaven, like what did you call it? The second death? Like that's seriously a thing.
Well, the second death. Okay. You don't know this. All right.
No, I don't know this.
Okay. So the idea is a little lesson in cut theology is that your soul is created with a twin flame in the beginning, and then you have to, and some souls embody, others don't. There's other ways of doing it, but so souls that were created for Earth and for other planets, you have to embody and you have to re-embody and keep coming back. And one of the things that can happen is that your twin flame can get lost, and so there was this whole drama that happened with El Moria's twin flame. I don't know if any of you guys have heard about that, but this was around the time of the shelter cycle where El Moria's twin flame was alleged to have been lost, and it had been like a prostitute somewhere, in some city in the world, and El Moria was despondent because now El Moria doesn't have a twin flame anymore. And this was literally what was discussed. And so we were all decreeing furiously, along with trying to prevent the war and along with trying to get the shelters done and along with trying to ward off the attacks from the fallen ones. We were also decreeing for El Moria's twin flame to be rescued, right? Because the risk was for El Moria that he would have to wait for her to go through her entire cycle of evolution to where she would be judged at the court of the sacred fire and sent to the second death. Her soul destroyed, a new soul created before he could have a twin flame again. So this is the ultimate punishment: is if you have exhausted your appeals with the karmic board and with it's laughable. Okay, this is like sci-fi bullshit. Okay, but,
wow.
If you've gone through all and you've been brought in front of the 4 and 20 elders at the court of the sacred fire, right? Mm. And they've all pronounced you to be irredeemable, then you get tossed into the lake of sacred fire and your soul is disintegrated.
Oh boy.
Yeah.
That sounds like something right out of like Greek or Roman mythology. I mean, that is out there.
That's the second death. So that was always held up that, it was one thing to lose your ascension, but if you took the left-handed path, and it wasn't all that remote. I mean, it was definitely reserved for people like Hitler or, people who committed crimes against humanity would be probably eligible for the second death, like right away. But a normal person, you might have to go through 100 more lifetimes of chances to redeem yourself. And then finally you get to that point where your time's up.
I think I remember this vaguely. I mean, I certainly remember the concept of being so evil that like that individual could be so evil and so polluted and so beyond redemption that they might end up in that kind of an environment. I don't know that I remember the exact terminology, but I certainly remember the concept as, as an evil thing. It's so interesting, right? And I think a lot of the people that I spend time with and that I talk to online and that who are my friends don't have a really good idea of how the evangelical or how a real right winger thinks about this sort of thing. But having grown up in the church, this idea, like I just remember growing up in this environment that was very sort of like sealed off, and then that there was these others out there, right? Like demons and discarnates, right? They're very like a nebulous sort of idea. Like it wasn't like sometimes it was individual people, right? But mostly like Peter Jennings, I think. I don't know if Peter Jennings, it doesn't matter. But in all seriousness, although Peter Jennings was a fallen angel, but also the correspondent on ABC News in the cafeteria it wasn't clear, but
Right.
It wasn't clear. Also, George W. Bush's Harriet Tubman. I don't know. Crazy things happen. But so like wow. This, like which was like wow. Like,
I don't remember that.
Yeah. I remember my dad telling me that.
You want to get into embodiments? Go ahead. But
getting into embodiment. That's like really like opening a can of worms here, because you can really go down the rabbit hole there.
Who are you, Sean?
Okay. Well, I'll tell you the first crazy one right now is that one of the lore that was going around in the church was that John Wilkes Booth had re-embodied as Sammy Davis Jr.
Okay.
And of course, my sister was one of my sisters. Yeah, Sammy Davis Jr. Yeah, it's just like, what do you do with that?
What do you even do with that?
John Wilkes Booth. It's like, oh, okay, like.
I mean, it's like so obvious, right? Like let me just let me link a obvious villain from the past to an obvious, what I want to be, who I want to be a villain now. It's like clumsy almost,
Well, and then Gregory Mull, who was the one who sued the church successfully and won $1.5 million. He was said to have been the guy who literally brought homosexuality to planet Earth from another planet.
Wow.
Wow. So that's how evil evil they really viewed homosexuality to be. Wow.
Oh yeah. And he was, of course, he was going to second death for sure. Right?
For sure. Yeah, for sure.
This was his last chance, and he betrayed the messenger of the Great White Brotherhood. And
right.
Well, I remember that, and that brings up the whole notion of like judgment calls and like feeling entitled to call judgment down and rain down thunder and lightning on people who were in opposition of church agendas, like people in the outlying community, people at the Livingston Enterprise, people, different politicians, just all across the board. I mean, it really kind of sort of disrupts this notion of altruism as being the central notion of a faith. I don't even understand like how that became a part of the doctrine. Is that something that you can explain, Sean?
Well, sure. I mean, spiritual warfare, right?
Right.
And everything is the battle of light and darkness, and battle for your soul, battle for Earth, battle for this this galaxy. The person in charge of the galaxy was, Alpha and Omega and Helios and Vesta in the great central sun, which was supposed to be the star Sirius. Now, I don't know why Sirius, but it's not certainly the biggest star or the brightest star, but maybe because it was called the dog star and then they flipped it around to be the God star. I think that's how Sirius got to be the great central sun. And this is, again, somebody's probably brain fart from who knows when. But that's what it was. So we here on Earth were the representatives of this galactic hierarchy. And so the fact that this galactic hierarchy would speak through my parents was, how privileged could you possibly be? Right? Not talking about the president, not the Pope. None of those people are important. It's my parents who are important, who were taking these messages from the galactic hierarchy, right?
Right.
And so that put them basically at the top. I mean, they were at the top level for all of Earth to take these messages, right? So anyone who would oppose them in any way, whether it's a journalist, whether it's an ex-member, anybody who left was decreed against. You guys have all seen the lists. You've seen those decree lists that went on and on and on for pages and pages of names. And
even going as far as your own sister, right? When
or me. When I left at a certain point, that I was in the sheets. I was in.
Were you really?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Oh,
absolutely.
Yeah. My dad. I distinctly remember stumbling on your website, Sean, when I was maybe 18 or 19, just out of sheer curiosity. And my dad's like, "Oh, don't go to that Black Sun website. He's under the influence of the fallen ones." And I was just just reading a few articles on his website. What's the harm in that? It was,
Well, that's one of the questions we had actually wanted to discuss is how do these people who are these spiritual leaders in these organizations actually treat the members of their family?
Well, and this is it. Again, family is not really relevant when you consider the galactic hierarchy and the Great White Brotherhood and all of this stuff. I mean, theoretically, we were all supposed to be high souls who had incarnated to do some great work in our lives to move this, the teachings forward on Earth, right? And we were expected to fulfill that role to become, Aaron was in training to be a messenger. And so any of us who would, again, the spiritual titles, I was supposed to be one of the 9 Buddhas that were holding the balance for the entire planet, right? I don't know who the other 8 were, but that's something I was told from the time I was, 5 years old or something like that.
Or a little orphan Sean Buddha boy.
Yeah, and it's like, and so I had this whole idea that I was the Buddha, and it's funny because when I left, I was actually working with a musician in Bozeman who was helping us on I was wrapping up a church project. I think I was recording the Shiva Bhajans album back in the day. And so I was working with him in his house in Bozeman, and he kind of got all serious at one point. And he goes, "So you're leaving?" And I was like, "Well, yeah." "Well, why are you leaving? How can you do that?" It's like, "Well, I don't want to be here anymore. I don't believe in it anymore. I just think I need to go make my own way." And he's like, well, so much for being the Buddha then.
What a crazy thing to hear.
It's like,
what?
And I hope he's hearing this, and I hope he's fucking embarrassed about that, because that was some bullshit.
It's a crazy thing to say.
Oh my God. That is so nutty.
It's nutty.
It's nutty. Yeah.
So, so my sister, obviously, all of us we're independent. One of the things, if my mother had really wanted us to stick around and be good little drones, she wouldn't have given us an education.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Mm.
And a lot of the kids who grew up in like the early 80s, like born in the early 80s or late 70s, they went to boarding schools.
Yeah.
Went to college, and that was part of their ticket out, was getting a higher education, getting perspective on the world, being in an environment away from their parents for a while, away from the church. And almost none of the people who grew up in the church, I would say between probably 80 and around 1980 to maybe 1990, almost none of those people are involved with the church now. And for a lot of good reasons.
And look what you said, Baird, about when you went to college. You finally got in front of someone who was going to challenge you a little bit and ask you to think about what your assumptions were.
Yeah, absolutely. Being away from home, higher education, I really feel bad for anybody who's there who hasn't gone off to college and had that healthy physical separation that kids go through as young adults, to be away from their parents for a while and develop their own ideas. Or just living away from home. It doesn't even have to be college. It can be, you meet other people in the world. And Annie spoke to this too. She had a friend that challenged her on a bunch of stuff and said, "Well, why do you believe these things?" Mm-hmm. And it really made her reevaluate like what she believed.
This is a big reason, I think, why Christians don't like education.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
They don't want their kids going to public school. They don't want their kids going to college and getting challenged. They want to keep them into these insular little communities. I am so opposed to homeschooling, not because I have a problem with, parents having say so over how their children's education, but because A, they don't do a good job. They indoctrinate them. B, they're not giving them an ability to think critically. If they would do that, then fine, homeschool your kid, but they're not doing that.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about homeschooling, and I was homeschooled for several years, and I wouldn't recommend it, but is that the person who is engaging in homeschooling is almost certainly doing so because they don't agree with the sort of majority, and there's really good reasons to not agree with the majority, like on a number of topics, but I think in terms of homeschooling in particular, you end up getting there's going to be fringe ideas are going to be overrepresented in that, like in the homeschooling community, right? Like, it's not means that everyone is whatever, but like you say, Sean, you like the reason, a lot of the times, the reason why people are doing the homeschooling is because they're concerned that their kids are not getting the fringe ideas that they want their kids to get in public school. And again, like, I can't say this enough, that's not always true, but I think there's probably a trend in that way. The transition for me from the church and the shelter cycle and everything else into northeastern United States American world was homeschooling, right? And my siblings were close, but because of the worldview that my parents had and that we had growing up, and we were in these sort of information silos, right? Where like I couldn't talk to my brother or my sister or about the experience of being an adolescent and I'm saying, like, of course, as an adolescent, I wouldn't talk about it like I'm talking about it now, right? But I couldn't talk to my brother about porno mags, right? And just to bring it back to porno mags, or I couldn't talk to about even smoking cigarettes at age 13 or 14, which I shouldn't have been doing for sure, but I was. And why I'm bringing this up, because when you live, it's almost like living in a authoritarian or like fascist environment, where I know that if I say something to them, they're going to tell my parents, right? And then I'm going to suffer. And so it ends up being like this world in which I grew up like very, and I wonder how you think about this, but like very isolated. Like I felt like I was only able to connect with people outside of my home, because within my home was almost like an unsafe place to express normal, everyday growing up type things, right? And so for me, that ended up being a real challenge. And instead, what I did was like, so I learned about sex from my friends, which is a terrible way to learn about sex, right? And I learned like terrible idea, right? Like awful, right? Like with 15-year-old boys, come on, right? And I learned about drugs in the same way, right? From 15-year-old boys, and actually, frankly, usually from like 17 or 18-year-old boys, or 19-year-old or 20-year-old boys who were telling me how to do X, Y, and Z drug. And instead of being introduced to these ideas and these concepts and these problems and these challenges of growing up with the guidance of a competent adult, instead, I felt terrified to even mention the fact that I even knew what drugs were, right? And that ends up being a recipe for disaster. And I can attest to that. It's a recipe for disaster. And I don't remember how I got here. As Sean knows, I love going on tangents and forgetting how I started. Like that is like part and parcel of being Christophe Difo.
We were talking about like the dynamic within families, and we had gotten here through how does the leader treat their family that the rest of the community is not going to know about. And Sean touched on his a little bit, and you touched on his earlier in saying that his mom Elizabeth Prophet gave him special privileges that the rest of the community couldn't have. And then with my dad and him starting his Cut 2.0, I mean, you can't even really call it that, because it was kind of like a carbon copy clone. It was almost like a Xerox of Cut.
It was. Down in every way, even down to like my parents took pilgrimages with people around the world, and he's doing the same thing.
Yeah. And he hasn't been super creative. I'm not trying to criticize this too much, but he hasn't been super creative about like the decrees and that stuff, because it's like same rhythm. Some of the decrees, he actually just like took the same melody, same meter, and then just changed a few of the words, like adding the word Buddha or adding the word crystal or adding the word light or whatever words that sounded good. They actually don't. Yeah.
Don't feel too bad about that, because my parents lifted a lot of that stuff from the I Am movement. And as a matter of fact, we found out from Joe Zimhart that the whole idea of color coding the decrees came from some, and I don't remember the name of the organization right now, but there was some organization that he named that actually originated that whole concept of color coding the decrees in the prayer books. So it's like,
there are no new ideas. There are like no new ideas. Everyone's just stealing everyone else's ideas and repackaging them in something newer.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. And then tying that back into like what went on at home.
Mm-hmm.
When I was, 2004 was when he started taking automatic writing, which is like thinking that the spirits are guiding you writing. He did that before he started taking verbal.
Was he using a pen or was he using a computer?
Oh, good question. I think it was pen. It was pen. And he took like 33 letters from, I don't know which master it was. I don't really care which master it is. But anyway, he took like 33 letters and then he showed it to some friends, and kind of in secret, he was sharing it with people. And then after he tried to apply to be a messenger of the church and got rejected from that to be the succession of Elizabeth Prophet, things started to get really, really uneasy at home. And he has anger management problems, but I didn't know the extent of what it was. I didn't know how bad it was going to get. And there were a couple times, well, at least one instance that really sticks in my mind, where I kind of challenged him a little bit on like, well, what are you doing with this? Like, why are you doing this? Like, is this even real? And he went into a rage. Like I'd never, up to that point in my life, I had never seen him behave that way, like to that extent. And the way he was verbally abusive to me, like indicated, would God choose someone who is capable of being abusive like this to do this mission? Number one. And number two, he decided that what he was doing was so important that it was more important than his kids. It was more important than his wife. And he basically, like, I don't think he gave my mom an ultimatum, but when she chose to divorce him, like that was the end of it. And that was the end of the family dynamic with him. And from then on, it was never the same, because he made a decision to abandon his family basically for what he was doing. But the verbal abuse and the and also some of the manipulation that went on behind the scenes of like, oh, don't you love me? Like he would constantly use that ploy of like, well, don't you love me? Don't you want to be a part of this? And not being able to separate his identity as a father from what he was doing. That really stuck out to me as like things that I think people should know, that if they knew what went on behind the scenes, or if they could be in my body for like a month and see through my eyes the way he behaved, no one would think it was real.
Well, this is just it, that if someone feels secure about their position, if they're, why would he get mad at his son questioning, right? Because it would be like, son, you don't understand. You'll learn, you'll know someday, whatever, that kind of thing. But for him to fly off the handle because you questioned is classic insecurity. Only people who are this is why Donald Trump has to tweet at everyone who says the slightest little thing, because he is so goddamn insecure, right? And so now we've been introduced to this as a nation, of this type of gaslighting where you question anything and you're just slammed, right? And so this is a pattern. My mom used to do it too. She was completely thin-skinned and her temper was legendary. I mean, you don't have to take my word for it. Like so many people have said so many things about her temper. I don't even need to say a word. But the fact of the matter is, one time, I was headed into Bozeman. I had the day off and I was going to go to Bozeman to do some shopping or something like that. And it was maybe about a year and a half before the shelter cycle. So she says to me on the phone, she says, I'm looking at the astrology today, and today is not a good day for car travel. And I was like, oh, really? I said, well, it must be nice to be able to be on that time schedule, because this is my day off and I got to go to Bozeman. I made some sarcastic comment or whatever it was. And she was like, don't you dare question the messenger when the messenger gives you a direction, And that's the kind of So I learned that was not okay.
Yeah,
You know
I think
what's so interesting, Sean? I'm sorry, Barry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just going to just inject real quick that the personal flaws and the personal issues that somebody has, I think they really like get accentuated when somebody takes on this position of power, this position of authority. That's all I wanted to add there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, and I'm curious because this is something that's been thrown around in group and amongst other people is the term narcissist in regards to your mother, Sean. Like, how do you feel about that?
Well, again, I'm not even though I spent a lot of time around therapists, I'm not a therapist. I don't know the clinical definition of the word narcissist, but certainly from the mythological definition of Narcissus, bending over the pond and seeing the reflection, and didn't Narcissus fall in love with the reflection? And isn't that the whole way the thing worked? So, how that translates, that just seems like self-absorption, right? So I don't know how that translates into power. I know that narcissism has a much more sinister definition therapeutically about it, as it relates to power and accountability and sociopathy, right?
I like to look at it as a spectrum and look at it as there's 4 qualifiers in regards to narcissism, and you've got strong, healthy narcissism, which makes a person, which is just your ordinary person who has had a lot of positive regard fed back to them. They have a strong sense of self. Their sense of self-worth is well established. They know who they are and how they function in the world. Strong, healthy narcissism. Then you have weak, healthy narcissism, and people like that are going to be more prone towards codependent dynamics. Their sense of self and their sense of worth is not as strong, but they're still not going to behave in overt abusive manners. They're not abusive. They're more likely to be abused. Then you have weak, toxic narcissism. Once again, you're going to find these people who are going to be more passive aggressive, leaning towards those codependent types of dynamics. They're going to be more on the covert side of the narcissism, and they are going to be abusive, but they're not going to be violent or overt about it. Then you have your strong toxic narcissism, and those people are abusive. They're overt about it. They're gaslighters. And I would say that, that Trump falls underneath that qualification. I'm not qualified to diagnose people either. I look at narcissism as a spectrum, and where you fall on it. Are you healthy? Are you strong? Are you weak? Are you toxic? And I think the indication of toxic narcissism is, to a large degree, how do the people who are around you feel about you? Are they capable of upholding you and uplifting you and supporting you? Or is their own sense of self and identity, like you said, is that so insecure? Is that so fragile that the only way that they can maintain that is to make sure that they are more important than everybody else, including their ideologies? Does that make sense?
There is something about Baird, both what your father and my mother have done, which is to elevate themselves to a point where they are presuming to be taking these messages from the God Star Sirius or wherever, right? That people should base their life decisions on, that people should change their lives. People should come into the teachings. They should, let my mom decide who they should marry, what they should name their child, all of these things, whether they should go back to school or come to work for the church. There's so many decisions that people allow to be made, and just setting yourself up for that role as being a guru and being someone.
If you look at it as a dynamic, right? It's like the people who are making those agreements to let these people make those decisions for them are going to be lacking in that sort of healthy narcissism. They don't trust in themselves. They want that external authority figure to make those important decisions for them. And that's one of my main problems with most religions is I feel like it's a system of holding people in a state of infantilism. Like people are not encouraged to grow up. That healthy sense of positive regard is not reinforced. Like what's the gaslighting is reinforced. That sense of questioning yourself, of your own ability to make these important life decisions for yourself is reinforced by these people who are like, oh yeah, I'll tell you who to get married or what to name your baby, right? It's like, and when you have somebody who's in a position, whether it's your mother, Sean, Elizabeth Clare Prophet, or it's Trump, it's a co-arising dynamic. One cannot arise to a position of toxic power without plenty of other people being willing to supersede their own sense of sovereignty and self in favor of taking direction from that figurehead. It's impossible.
Yep. And we're seeing this right now. We're seeing this with the challenging of the election results. I mean, this is something, I don't want to take this too far into politics, but this is very, very similar to the kind of nonsense that I got when I left the church. And it was very, very clear. Like, I knew what I saw. I was on the inside. I watched this organization operate for years. And I watched my mother operate for years. And then I'd get out and people they'd come over to Black Sun Journal, or they would write me emails or whatever, and they would attack me and say, you're wrong, you're lying, you're this or you're that. And it's like, no, I'm not. I'm telling you the truth. I was there.
I was there.
I had people say to me literally that they knew my mother better than I did. I said, oh, you mean the person who spent 30 years with her? You know her better than that? Her son? You know that you know her better than that, and so this is the kind of guff that I got. Basically, what you're seeing and what you're hearing is not what's happening. Right? That gaslighting.
Gaslighting 101.
Yeah.
Since we're well underway here, Justice, could you tie in kind of the story of your dad and how a charismatic leader, again, another example of kind of what goes on the inside and what goes on behind the scenes?
Yeah, I mean, I'm in the same boat with you and Sean in regards to my father sort of stepped into this identity of, creating. He did it in such a way where he was actually sort of distributing these special powers. Like, he had found a mythology combined with spirituality and consciousness and science that allowed for people to create an interface where they had some power and some direction over their reality. And phenomena is an amazing thing. It is. I've witnessed things happen within this system that were unexplainable. And I was a member of it. I taught right alongside of him for about 6 years, and I believed, and I believed in the power of this to change people's lives. It's like what he said was that anybody could do this, and that anybody could probably even do it better than he could. But that sense of insecurity in him, when people would actually become proficient, would become successful, he'd go after them. He'd sue them. He'd tear them down. He would tear me down for the way that I would teach and present in front of hundreds of people. Like, the gaslighting was not indirect or like behind the scenes. He would literally come up and interrupt me in the middle of what I was saying, presenting, because he was so insecure with me, breaking through this glass ceiling that he had created, because I was just his child. Like, I had no authority to challenge, or even really not to challenge. I wasn't interested in challenging. I'm just standing on my own. As with so many of these kind of cult mentalities, there's a lot of spiritual bypassing that was going on. There was a lot of what I would call, from a phenomenon standpoint, there was, due to the group capacity, the group think and the group trance, there's this ability to reorganize mass amounts of energy, like in an instant, but without any kind of substantial psychological reframing. Whatever happened to be reorganized in that instant would often come back. It would remanifest. So it was like this very temporary phenomena-based effect that created this sort of wave of excitation through the group that would feed that back to the person on the stage. Right? You get the phenomena that I'm describing.
I do. I'm curious. Is this the group called Matrix Energetics?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. I was curious because that is, I've looked them up, and I kind of knew that was your dad's thing, but I had no idea that you were involved in it yourself as a presenter.
I was on stage from 2006 to 2011, to the end of 2011. And what drove me to leave was the lack of emotional accountability that was being represented on the stage. There was a good amount of gaslighting going on when people would come up to talk about their stories. And like, from a standpoint, like, there is usefulness in sort of removing yourself from the trauma of your story, but invalidating someone's story as they're sharing it is like, it's spiritual bypassing, it's emotional bypassing. It is skipping over the work. It's dehumanizing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it would sort of take too much time in this sort of need to have these instantaneous, fantastic results, sort of phenomena-based presentation. So it was getting skipped over. For me personally, like, we had a really rough family history. And what I began to see was like, I left Bozeman in 2004. I moved out to Seattle. I went to massage school. He paid for me to go to massage school. He put me up on stage and started teaching. And then as soon as I started growing and standing up in myself, he started undermining me and tearing me down professionally and personally and gaslighting me, right? And it was like this reawakening of all of these childhood wounds where I had experienced neglect, I'd experienced abuse, I had experienced all the same stuff as a child that I was re-experiencing now as an adult in front of hundreds of people. I was like, yeah, it was great. It was super fun. And I didn't exactly know what was happening, right? Like I was in my late 20s into my early 30s. I was 31 when I left in 2011. So I got put in this wonderful position where I got to speak to meet thousands of people from all over the world. And then it started to catch up to me, the sort of incongruity, the cognitive dissonance, and going through, I was still in therapy myself. And I get to that point, as you do, where like you need accountability for your childhood experiences. Mm-hmm. And you don't necessarily need to take the people who were abusive or neglectful to you, they may never take accountability for what they did, but you need to be able to move to a point in your own consciousness where you're like, I'm going to demand this accountability and I'm going to put myself in a position where I can see the person in the light that is appropriate for me to be able to move forward and heal. Mm-hmm. And I invited him when I got to that point I invited him and was like, this is where I'm at. And if we don't address our family history, I'm going to leave. And he was like, what are you talking about? I was like, would you like to start with the abuse or would you like to start with the neglect? And he was like, I have no idea what you're talking about. And then he was like, well, there was that one incident, but we're all fine from that. And I looked at him, I was sitting over at this, I know, right? We're all fine from that. We're sitting across the table at like this Mexican restaurant. Like, no, we're not. We're not all fine from that. Like, we're definitely not all fine. Mm-hmm. And he's like, well, okay. Like, and that was it. Like that, like I was completely dismissed on the front of this underlying toxic structure that was impacting our dynamic on stage. And that I could see it. I could see it in the way that people would react to when he would act out, right? And I could see it like off the stage, and I still had people like rushing me, like, it must be so wonderful, right? I'm sure you get this, Baird. I'm sure you get this, Sean. Isn't it so wonderful to be their child? Isn't it just the most magical thing? Didn't you have the best childhood? And I got to the point where I would take a breath and I would be like, do you have family problems? And people would be like, yes, of course. And I'll be like, me too.
As basic as that. That's a good
answer.
That's a great answer.
I never got to that point. Basically, I was always so intimidated because I felt like I had to play this role. And people would come up to me and they would, oh, can you give your mother this? Or can you tell your mother this? Or can you ask your mother this for me? All the time, constantly. And what it kind of ruined me in a way for social interaction, because what happened is that we'd have these conferences 4 times a year, and they happened starting from the time I was, 5 years old or younger. And so all these people would come and I get all this attention from them, but it wasn't for me. It was for, I realized that it was this was redirected attention. And so as I got to be a teenager, I got very sullen. I got very good at avoiding people's eyes, at walking past people. And I used to call it, I need to go over and get something from the cafeteria, but I don't want to be accosted, And so I would plan my trips even to go to the bathroom or whatever. I would wait for people to not be there during a conference so that I could get in and get out, and without being, having to, because I didn't like to be rude to the people. After a while, I kind of was, but it felt like this was my role to play, to sort of be an ambassador whenever they're during a conference, to to welcome these people and be friendly to them. But since they had no interest in me whatsoever, after a while, it got to be the point where I just didn't want anything to do with it. So
Wow.
when I left the church, I had a very hard time in social situations because it was tough for me to believe that anybody would be interested in me at all. Right.
Interesting.
And particularly women. I mean, after I got divorced and stuff, it was just rough because I'd been the center of this big fishbowl for all these years. But people weren't interested in me. They were interested in getting through me to someone behind me. So I kind of worked through that, but it took a little while.
And I resonate with you said about being put on the list, because when I stepped away, we had study groups, like my right to teach study groups was revoked. They wouldn't let me say goodbye to the community. They just kind of sort of silently disappeared me. And then when I mentioned the fact that I love doing this kind of work and that at some point I would be continuing on, he threatened to sue me.
Your own dad threatened to sue you? Wow.
He said, if it looks anything like, if it resembles my work in any way, shape, or form, I will come after you and sue you like I would anyone else. I was like,
wow.
Okay.
Yeah.
That just happened.
Yeah.
When you're with a cult leader, right? And you're part of their inner circle, I can imagine how that would be very destabilizing. This is my fucking father, So I'm still very much in that mindset of being a devoted daughter. I'm still cooking Christmas dinners and he's still being well, maybe I'll come, maybe I won't.
So wait, even after he threatened to sue you, you still have a relationship with him?
I don't know. I don't know. But with that narcissistic sort of codependent programming, having been ingrained in me my entire fucking life, it took a while to break free of that. And one of the final straws for me was sort of looking at it as a dynamic in my life and being okay, I broke up with this relationship, I ended this friendship, and then I was oh, and here's you, the root of all evil in my life. I'm done fucking talking to you too.
Yeah.
We're done. And it's been really cathartic. It's been really cathartic to do, I think, for people who who are in that situation. And I dealt with it from the community. I have people who I didn't even know, because I'll talk about it in public. I'll post about it, especially when it was really fresh. That's how I process. I talk to my Facebook community, I write. And I would have people I didn't even know being you're the more emotionally mature person in this relationship. It's your responsibility to build a bridge. It's your responsibility to reach out. It's your responsibility from this more emotionally, spiritually evolved place to help him evolve. I'm
this is the way that the New Age community really, really amplifies abuse.
Yes.
The idea that we must forgive, the idea that we must reach out, the idea that we can't burn bridges. Never in that dynamic is the idea that the other person has to make amends, that they have to, they have to own what they did, because half the time they're asking you to forgive this person who hasn't even admitted what they did.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. This is, you see this over and over and over again, this idea that because we have found ways to move past that kind of gaslighting, move past that kind of psychological abuse, frankly, and get to a place where we are okay, and that we owe it to our parents, even, right? To reconnect with them just because they happen to be our parents. This is, look, I mean, I know for me, one of the challenges that I've had is, right, because in the beginning, it was I just put my parents at absolute blackout, right? I'm not talking to them. I don't want to see them, because frankly, I needed to heal, right? I needed an environment in which they couldn't influence me at all. Literally, when I finally made the full cut, I mean the full cut from cut and the break from cut. And when I finally did that, and also simultaneously Alcoholics Anonymous and the entire world that I had grown up, that environment that I needed to be in London I was doing my summer after my first year of law school. I did a summer abroad in London, and that was where I was able to make the emotional and mental cut, because I literally had to be an ocean away of separation, like that, like different time zones, 6-hour time zone differences, right? And I was able to really make a full break at that point. And by the way, I nearly collapsed emotionally and psychologically, because I mean, I didn't realize how much I had been relying on that structure for a sense of meaning, a sense of purpose, a sense of everything. And so, like, that was an important bridge for me to cross. But I'm just sort of identifying a little bit with you on this. And, you know, I don't have the experience, obviously, of having parents who are running an organization like that. But I can say with certainty that that kind of mentality trickles down.
Yes.
I can tell you that from personal experience, right? And you live in an environment where that is like unhealthy for all the same reasons that the cult is unhealthy, right?
Yes.
It's still that same top-down structure. It's still that same sort of these sort of like hard and fast rules that cannot be even talked about, right? I mean, it's still the belt, right? It's like it's getting whipped by the belt, right? Like that's what it was growing up.
It's the teachings. It's not the organization. It's the
Exactly.
It gets into your head. It doesn't matter where you are. Family could be anywhere. I mean, I think it was worse for people who were living in the community in some ways. But I think that people were perfectly capable of recreating these kinds of structures in their own families, no matter where in the world they were. I mean, you could be in Australia.
Yep.
You know?
Yep. And I was in New Jersey in in a normal everyday, although not normal every day, because it was an affluent environment that we were not affluent, but it was an affluent environment. So I don't want to say that was normal, but it was definitely like a normal Jersey suburb. And still my parents were able to recreate that 1992 like sort of mental and emotional structure within our home, and and ended up, and that was a really difficult thing to detox from. And I'm friendly with my mom and like these days, and we talk and everything like that. And my dad and I are a little bit because we talked earlier about the homophobia, that was a line in the sand that I drew, and that was just no. But still, and so my point is that I've come to terms with this, right? Like I have a sense of a different identity from who I was back then, and I understand who my parents are, and I understand their flaws and what they did that was really great and everything else. But it doesn't mean that I don't remember and recognize the impact that kind of stuff had on the kind of person I am today. And look, I mean, we're doing this podcast, Radical Secular Podcast, in large part or in significant part as a counterbalance to that, to all of those ideas, that mentality and that hierarchy and that structure and all of it.
It turns out actually that my biggest frustration is I got out of this cult that I was raised in, and the entire nation is now in a cult. And it's like there's very little daylight between fundamentalist Christians and their worldview and the cut worldview. So we believe in reincarnation. We believe in a few Eastern masters, but functionally, practically, it is evangelical Christianity.
Absolutely.
Mixed with Catholicism, mixed with a little New Age blended in there. But it's very, very, the structure, the same kind of, the idea that Donald Trump has is being overshadowed by God, or that he was put in place by God, or that Jesus is overshadowed. That is just, I mean, it is so cut-like. I mean, we used to talk about getting the Ascended Masters to take over the U.S. government. And we used to decree for that the sons and daughters of God would take over all aspects of the U.S. government, and that is theocracy. That's what we are in direct opposition to. So in reality, the entire point of our podcast is in opposition to that same thing and in defense of a free, secular, democratic society, which is everything cut wasn't, everything Republicans aren't.
Yeah, I want to reference a clip because you're talking about hierarchy.
Yeah.
And your show that you just did, episode 20, you referenced a linguist who had a really great, in a nutshell, what conservative moral hierarchy is. And I'm going to read his, and then I'm going to kind of slide in there what the cut one is, because it's just slightly modified with a little more hierarchy. So his name was George Lakoff, and he said that the conservative moral hierarchy is God above man, man above nature, the disciplined or strong above the undisciplined or weak, the rich above the poor, employers above employees, adults above children, Western culture above other cultures, America above other countries, men above women, whites above non-whites, Christians above non-Christians, straights above gays. And so that, like, you guys said that it would be hard for a conservative person to look at that list and not be like, oh yeah, that's true. And that was kind of a light bulb moment in terms of like the hierarchy that we were brought up with. And I would add, it would be God and ascended masters and angels above man, the messenger above the devotees. So all the people that are accepting the messages from the messenger, light bearers above non-light bearers, and then drug-free individuals above drug users, and people with bad karma over people that have lesser karma. So there was a more intense, in some ways, a more intense hierarchy, because there's so many people that are below you if you're a light bearer on this mission, and it just fills your head with a lot of like also being beholden to the messenger too. It's the other direction that you guys mentioned. It's that there's somebody that's your master, somebody that's above you.
Yep.
You have to obey.
Goes both ways. It's critical. It's critical that it goes both ways. You have a position in the hierarchy, right? And you're dominant above on everyone below you, and you are like 100% supplicant or subservient, to everyone above you. Like, that is critical.
There's a whole other set of videos that's actually really good that we have watched about hierarchy that we could maybe put in the show notes, but it really expands on this idea with reference to the book, The Reactionary Mind, which is a really excellent exploration of conservatism. But I want to bring up something else that my parents did, and they were both involved in this. They were both involved in the writing. They had another method of dehumanization and of sort of sidetracking whole groups of people. And obviously there were the fallen ones and the laggards and the this and the that. They had all these different definitions of levels of dark forces. But the one that they always talked about was the mechanization man. And their sort of cosmology was, it had something to do with these writings of Zecharia Sitchin and the 12th planet and all that kind of stuff, where there had been this race of people who had been bred between aliens and humans. And there was another race that was robots. And it was just the idea that there were just different evolutions of people, and the light bearers were above all of those evolutions. And these other lesser people, which some of that may have been correlated with races, some of that may have been correlated with nationalities, or just people who weren't in the church, it was easy to categorize these people into this kind of cosmic caste system that you're talking about here. She used to say to me sometimes, oh, that person's a robot, or, and just literally write people off.
Right.
And this was especially true for people who had been on staff or been in the community and then left for whatever reason. She took everybody leaving as a personal betrayal. And then she would also start to denigrate that person and start to come up with all sorts of, terrible people they'd been in their past life, or they were a robot, or they were, a fallen angel. Especially if somebody was attractive, they were a fallen angel, right? David Bowie was definitely a fallen angel.
Right. Oh man, David Bowie is super of that era too. That at that time. So
in terms, just to sort of wrap it all up, right, is like for all of you, from what I'm hearing, is that leaving the church, leaving the cult, leaving that mindset and that worldview is a process, right? It doesn't happen overnight. It's not like you flip a switch, but there are like remarkable moments along that journey, right? And for me, it started with mouthwash, right? It went on into like my favorite band, Bad Religion, and hearing and a secular perspective, a reason-based perspective, another like a non-authority based sort of approach to understanding the world. I think we should all give ourselves credit, because that path is not an easy path to walk. Undoing that kind of brainwashing, that kind of worldview that demands that we be dependent upon someone essentially tell us how to live and how to think and how we should think about ourselves and how we should think about our sexuality and how we should think about drugs and how we should think about literally whether or not to have children. Like coming back from that is a real challenge. And again, for me, it was very, very, very much intertwined with recovery from drug use. I can connect and sort of connect with all of you about how nuanced that process is, how challenging that process is, how long that process is. But ultimately, just being on the other side and being free. I almost look back and I'm like, I mean, I don't recognize the person I was. I feel like I was in prison, or I was in in Star Trek terms, the mirror universe, and I'm so happy that we are able to have these sort of conversations. The Facebook group has been amazing. Being able to reconnect with all of you has been amazing. Being able to understand your stories and your experience and reflect on my own has been amazing. So thank you so much for having us on. And I'll pass it off to somebody else.
What I want to say is that if I could have, at the age of 30 or so when I left, if I could have imagined myself sitting here right now doing this and having this conversation, I would have been ecstatic. Mm. And the place that I had to get to in order to do that involved, it's like Christophe said, it's a long journey, but I just kind of want to set some goalposts. And that is, you need to, in order to be okay, being out of your cult or religion or whatever it is, you need to understand and accept yourself as a physical being. And you need to understand and accept the universe as a physical universe. Everything in the universe has a physical cause. There's no spirits or masters or devils or demons or anything else like that. It's atoms and it's molecules and it's quarks and whatever other particles there are. And involved in all of that is quantum physics, and there's certain things that are not predictable, but there are other things that are very predictable. You have to get into exploring notions of free will. You have to get into exploring and accepting your mortality, and the fact that this is the hook. The hook that they get everyone on is that you have an immortal soul. You do not. Mm-hmm. You do not have an immortal soul. You are a mammal. We are all mammals. We are subject to mammal drives. The reason we do what we do, the reason we want what we want, is because of our genes. This is how we evolved. And so self-acceptance is a big part of this journey. That gets you off the hook for all this religious guilt. And I understand the guilt and I understand the fear, because it's a lot. It's a lot, especially when you grow up with it and you just kind of feel this stuff in your bones. Like this, what we were talking about, gay people. You feel that's so wrong, and if you ever did that, it would just be the worst thing in the world. And it's not. It's not. This is this is manufactured. This is something that is manufactured out of the whole cloth. And when these messengers get up there and they rail and they talk and they threaten and it's abuse. That is just flat out abuse. And anyone who has a healthy upbringing or who has managed to journey to a healthy place understands that those types of sermons and fire and brimstone and threats are abuse. And so you really have to get to this place. A lot of people think that the scientific physical worldview is cold and devoid of meaning. And that's the trap, right? Because they want you to believe in these spirits. They want you to believe in souls so that you can have some meaning in your life. And like, is this all there is? How greedy are religious people to think that they get more after this life is over? I mean, isn't this enough, right? So you have to get into really that understanding, or you will get pulled back into various religions and cults. You will substitute one for the other. There's plenty of people who cult hop from one organization to the next. And after they finish giving all their money and spending years of their life in one cult, then they get disillusioned and they go right into the next cult. And then they go right into the next cult. And there's some people that are 3 or 4 deep in this. And then they'll leave cut and they'll go and become a fundamentalist Christian. And there were some people who were actually in the cut group, the cut kids group, who were kind of preaching Christianity. I just blocked them because that's just not, you're either out or you're in. I think that in my life and what I've learned from, the growing up in the community and it's been almost 30 years that I've been out of the community now. And you can't compromise with these ideologies. They're too destructive. They're too dangerous. I'm grateful that we've had a chance to talk about all this. And, Barrett, I really appreciate you having us on and me on, because again, we in our podcast focus a lot on politics and we just kind of touch on these things, but this was a little bit more of a deep dive, and maybe we can do more.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
My closing thought would be, if anybody's listening who is in a religious group, especially if it's cut, the Heart Center, any group that has an ideology where you have this person who's above you, who's giving you information, be willing to listen to outside perspectives about politics, about yourself, about your sexuality, about your worldview, because you can parallel an environment like that to China or North Korea, because they are really cut off from other ideologies, other perspectives, and they are either punished for seeking those out or they're blocked from doing it altogether. If you're somebody who is kind of seeking out other information, just be willing to be flexible and understand that flexibility is not a weakness. And seeking out other information does not make you weak. It actually makes you more educated. It makes you more compassionate, and it makes you more empathetic. And the more empathy people have, and the more you humanize the person next to you, really the better person you're going to be. It doesn't matter if you have religion or not.
I respect that you guys are atheist or agnostic. I personally feel that there is more than the mechanics of life, but that any time that you're going to explore along that line of thinking, that you absolutely have to fucking take your humanity along with you. Anything that insists that you divorce yourself from your body, from your life, from the earth, from other people, from being respectful of other people's free will, and from the process of consent, that becomes fascist. That becomes what's the word the new age fundamentalism, that becomes
Conspirituality.
I love
casual fascism.
Casual fascism.
Yeah, I love that.
Absolutely. And from a standpoint, like I love the concept of mythology. I think it's beautiful. Human minds have been searching for a way to make meaning of life since our conception. And the origins of that were actually very practical. So it's a way of, if you're going to choose to have a spiritual theology, make sure that it brings you into life. Make sure that it makes you more relatable to life and life more relatable to you. It doesn't leave out scientific progress. It doesn't leave out the notions of where you come from. And it doesn't make you above or better than anyone in an emotional, a spiritual, or a physical sense. There's no such thing as a human hierarchy. The only thing that genuinely makes us better or worse than any of each other is the capacity and willingness that we have, the skillfulness to deal with and navigate our own fucking trauma, and the compassion that naturally develops as a process when we go through that process ourselves. So if anything, I think what the world needs is it needs to build a bridge between its mythos, between its ideology and its humanity. And I personally believe that that as a practice actually would look a lot like all of us getting a lot more honest with our pain and what it is that we're doing to soothe and comfort that. Because to a large degree, that's where religion's born from. It comes from this need to explain the world. It comes from this need to explain away or soothe our pain. And the more honest we can be with our pain, particularly as a portal to the numinous, to the actual mystery, the more in touch we are going to become with our humanity, and the more likely that any mythos that we find ourselves gravitating towards to kind of build that bridge between mind and body and the explainable and visible world and the invisible, it's going to include that. It's going to include life. It's going to be life friendly. It's not going to be a fucking death cult. It's not going to require you to remain an infant in your progress. It's going to invite you into maturity. It's going to invite us into cooperation, interdependence with each other. These are the myths that we need to be looking for. These are the practices that we need to be stepping into. And whether you choose to do that from an atheist interface or whether you choose to do that as holding that there is something deeper, there is something more meaningful. For me, it's kind of a Gnostic interface with life. I consider myself a partnership with life, with the earth. There's nothing that I'm trying to get to beyond being the best version of myself that I can be here, and including in that everything that I see around me, with my care, with my compassion, with my accountability. And if you're choosing a spiritual interface that invites you to step away from that, you need to fucking rethink your mythology.
Yeah, that was really well put, Justice. Do one of you guys want to mention where everybody can find your podcast, how they can connect with you?
Sure. We are The Radical Secular, and we're on YouTube. We're on Apple, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Amazon. We're on a couple of these podcast hosts over in India. I think it's Gavin and... Anyway, we'll have to put that in the show notes. But we have a Facebook page, we have Instagram, and we have Twitter. So it's basically if you just Google The Radical Secular, you'll find us. And
then Justice, do you want to mention where people can find you?
www.illuminationwithjustice.com. And I'm on Instagram as Illumination with Justice. And you can friend me on Facebook, please. I like having a broad community. And I think that I'm not very active on Twitter. Sorry, guys, I'm lazy there, but
Twitter's tough.
It is. You got to be famous already.
You have to be famous already, basically.
Yeah, I agree with that. You can find Blinded by the Light on YouTube. If you don't use podcasting apps, you can find us on most of the major podcasting apps. And we occasionally post on Twitter. We'll probably have a Facebook page up before too long, and also at blindedpodcast.com. And any listeners can send us a question, or if they're interested in being on the show, blindedpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you guys for joining us in this conversation. It was really great. It went deep, and I think we're going to probably have to do a couple more episodes because we only got about halfway through it.
So good to see you guys. Like Christophe, I don't think I've seen you since we were kids or something.
Honestly, since like a conference in like 1990s, that was
right.
Yeah.
So good to see you and see you thriving. And Sean, so good to see you too. Like, you were this weird figurehead of my childhood that like you're so human and relatable. It's so awesome.
That's what 30 years of being out of a cult can do to you.
Right.
Exactly.
But no, it was great. It was great seeing everybody, and I'm so glad, Baird, that you started doing this and set this up for us.
Thank you, guys.
Baird.
If you enjoyed this podcast, the best thing you can do to support us is telling your friends and family. Building a community around these topics matters because having our voices heard can mean greater healing and insights into our collective experiences. Subscribe to Blinded by the Light in your favorite podcast app, or subscribe to our YouTube channel to get the latest episodes. If you'd like to be on the show or want to send us stories for consideration, email the show at blindedpodcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.